I'm Glenn Campbell with a superficial guide to Africa. This is the latest in my superficial guide series where I give you just the highlights of a place, just general overview, so you know where to go and you'll know whether you want to go to this place at all. This is the fourth edition of the superficial guides. I previously covered Eastern Europe in one episode and the Alaska Highway in another, and my most recent one was Iceland. Now I'm going to tackle the entire continent of Africa, which is a little difficult because I haven't been to the entire continent of Africa. Unlike Europe, I have indeed been to every country of Europe, just about. But Africa I've only sampled. I've seen 11 countries in Africa, and there are about 54 altogether. So I'm no Africa authority. I've taken 5 trips to Africa, set foot there 5 times between 2010 and 2017 for a grand total of about 7 weeks. Which, if this is more time than you've spent in Africa, then I have some insight to offer you. I have some advice. I can't tell you about everything, but I can tell you about what I've seen and things that happened to me, and I can give you the broad overview of where to go and whether you should go at all. And the answer to the last question, should you go to Africa, is no. So my first piece of advice is don't go to Africa. So based on my experience, 7 weeks in Africa, my first piece of advice for you, someone who hasn't been to Africa, is don't go to Africa. That's your baseline condition. Africa is not for amateurs. It's a dangerous place. I mean, I hate to lump a whole continent into this category, but Africa on the whole is dangerous for outsiders. Of course, there are places that are safe. There are places that are very welcoming, but you don't know where those places are. You don't know where the dangers are. So by default, don't go to Africa unless you're a seasoned traveler who has already seen a substantial portion of the rest of the world, or you're with a seasoned traveler, or you have some local contact who can shepherd you around and keep you safe, or you have some sort of business in Africa and you have to go there for that business. One of the main reasons you would want to go to Africa is if you are trying to solve the problems of Africa. If you are some sort of a philanthropist or altruistic theorist and you want to solve the problems of extreme poverty in Africa, maybe you ought to see extreme poverty in Africa before you make many conclusions. So in conclusion, don't go to Africa. So why, if my only advice is don't go to Africa, then why am I recording this whole podcast? Well, I want to give you a taste for Africa. I want to tell you what my concerns are. I'm going to proceed as though you were going to Africa and point you in the right direction. I want to talk about the issues, the safety issues involved in going to Africa and why it is generally unsafe. So I'm going to talk at length about my time in Africa, and maybe that's just so you don't have to. I just want to give you an impression of what it's really like on the ground. So this is 2020, December 2020, and my last visit to Africa was June of 2017. I found the experience very valuable in many different ways, but I do not expect to go back in my lifetime. My risk tolerance has gotten lower over the years. I'm more inclined to look after my well-being. I would bounce over to Europe in a minute. I would go anywhere in Europe. I would go anywhere in Israel and feel perfectly safe. But Africa is hard. Africa's got a lot of hard edges and a lot of sharp things that can hurt you. So my first visit to Africa was just sticking my toe in the water. I took a ferry across the Straits of Gibraltar from Tarifa to Tangier, Morocco on a little day tour, and I saw the Kasbah in Tangier. This was October of 2010, so just 4 hours on the continent of Africa. My second trip was in 2015. I visited Marrakech for 36 hours. So that was enough. I went on and saw other parts of the world. I filled in my map of Europe. I actually flew around the world and saw some countries in Asia. And only then did I feel confident enough to tackle the deepest, darkest heart of Africa. And I did that in 2 trips in 2017. About 2 weeks in February 2017 and about 4 weeks in June of 2017. So I rented a car both times. I flew into South Africa and saw a lot of South Africa as well as some of the peripheral countries. So the countries I've been to are, and one other visit to Africa was Egypt. In 2011, I crossed the Sinai Desert by bus from Israel to Cairo. And this is not something I would ever recommend to anyone else. I did this in a sort of a quiet period between the revolutions in Egypt. It wasn't outwardly dangerous at the time, but I think it was foolhardy. I don't think I would do it again. I'll tell you about Egypt later, but don't go to Egypt. So all the countries I visited are Morocco, Egypt, South Africa, Swaziland and Lesotho, which are 2 little countries embedded in South Africa, and Namibia, Botswana, a little bit of Zimbabwe and Zambia when I saw Victoria Falls, and Nairobi, Kenya, and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And what were the highlights of all these journeys? Well, one highlight is seeing all that wildlife, all that giant wildlife of Africa, the elephants and zebras and lions and other and rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and giant crocodiles that Africa is known for, and saw them all in the wild from the comfort of my rental car. And the place I did this was Kruger National Park, east of Johannesburg, about 3 or 4 hours east of Johannesburg. So if you think that you need to join some kind of safari in Africa and spend thousands of dollars to see this incredible wildlife, you're wrong. You can do it all in a day, based in Johannesburg. And you do that by visiting Kruger National Park, and it's just like a drive-through wildlife park, except the wildlife is real, and you are the intruder. You're not allowed to get out of your car. You could just drive through and see the giraffes and rhinoceri and stuff. So we'll get to that later. The other high points of Africa, the penguins of the south coast of South Africa, near Capetown, Boulder Beach, near Capetown, where there are penguins nested on the beach, and you can actually go down and talk to them. I went and talked to the penguins. I found Kenya and Egypt very frightening. Would never set foot in either country again. But surprisingly, I really enjoyed Ethiopia. I felt very comfortable and safe in Ethiopia. And I'll talk about that when I get to Ethiopia. Marrakech in Morocco is an exception to this rule. I'm not saying don't go to Marrakech. Morocco is very European. It feels very European. It's got a lot of the Arabic flavor. It's a Muslim country. It's got a lot of the Arabic flavor, but it also looks an awful lot like Spain. It is overrun by European tourists. So Morocco is kind of an exception. You should go to Marrakech, I think. You just have to realize it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit riskier than Europe. The gold standard for safety in world travel is Europe. I consider Europe the safest place in the world. That includes my own country. I feel safer in Europe than I do in my own country. And I would go anywhere in Europe without any fear for my safety. That does not apply in Africa. Virtually everywhere I go in Africa, including Marrakech, I'm watching my back. The big issue in Africa is crime. And the crime arises because there's such a huge discrepancy between rich and poor. And how this is expressed on the ground is by huge walls that are topped by barbed wire or electric fencing. So wherever you go in Africa, if you check into a hotel, go to a hostel, or you visit someone in their home, you're going to find that they live in a secure compound. This is true almost everywhere in Africa. If you own a home in Africa, you have a tall wall around it, and you've got either concertina wire or electric wiring at the top of that wall. It's almost a universal. Everywhere there is private property in Africa, there is this huge fence. You have people who are living basically suburban lifestyles like you would imagine in the US, but we don't have these houses, these freestanding houses with nothing between the neighbors but a little courtesy fence. That just won't fly in Africa. In Africa, you've got to have this big security fence. And when I went to a guest house near Kruger National Park, the owner of the guest house, this was right adjacent to the park, you could look out on the park, and the owner of the guest house explained it to me. They used to have just this 8-foot high fence. And then what happened is that their lawn furniture started disappearing. So they were forced to put up the electrified fence around their compound. And so when you go to this guest house, you've got to ring the buzzer in the front, and somebody's going to come and open the gate and let you in. And that's how Africa works. That's just the way Africa works. From one end to the other, every place there is property, there's a high security compound. And that's because there are so many poor people with nothing to lose that they will take enormous risks for relatively little gain. A curious aspect of the vehicles, I've rented cars twice in South Africa, and one curious little feature on the cars is if you have a car in America or Europe, and there's a little button in front that will open the back hatch, the back trunk. And in Europe and America, you press that little button and the trunk pops open in the back. And in Africa, you press the button and nothing happens. It just latches the back. The back does not pop open, because if the back ever did pop open and you weren't right there to guard it, someone would reach in and grab all the stuff that's in the trunk. You know, you stop at a stoplight and the windows are open in your car. Someone is going to reach in and grab something off the seat of your car. That's how desperate things are in Africa. So with that little warning out of the way, I'll come back to safety later. Safety includes crime, it includes corruption, which is where the police are the criminals, and it includes health and safety, where you have to worry about getting diseases and being run over by vehicles. So we'll get to all those safety issues later. For now, I want to give you an overview, a review of the countries that I've visited in Africa, and tell you what I know about them. So I mentioned that Kruger National Park is the place to see wildlife. You spend one day there, you'll get all the wildlife out of your system, and you don't need a fancy safari. And then you have the penguins of Capetown. And the other cool thing in Africa are the sand dunes of Namibia. And Namibia is one of the emptiest countries in the world, emptiest country at least in Africa. It's filled with sand dunes, this sort of primordial desert. I don't consider it particularly dangerous because there simply aren't any people in Namibia. People are limited to villages, and the rest of Namibia is just kind of a big dust bowl. It's like the planet Tatooine, it's like Luke Skywalker's desert planet. That's what Namibia is. There are the pyramids of Egypt. I was underwhelmed by the pyramids of Egypt, and the fact that Cairo itself is such a dangerous place makes me less want to recommend them. But anyway, let's go through this country by country, starting with the country I know the best, that I've spent the most time in, which is South Africa. On my first visit to South Africa, it was February, 2 weeks in February, which is summer in the southern hemisphere. So February was quite hot. I didn't have enough really light clothing. And my mission was to see Capetown and to rent a car, drive it north and drop it off in Johannesburg, stopping at these two other little countries along the way, Lesotho and Swaziland. So that was 2 weeks. The first thing I did when I landed in Capetown is I checked into a hostel and visited those penguins. Now right away, of course, the first thing I'm noticing is these high security compounds. Wherever anyone has any property, a business or a house, there are walls around it, but there are exceptions. And these exceptions are guarded neighborhoods. So what will happen is the business owners of a certain neighborhood will gather together and hire security guards to patrol the street. And they control parking on that street, and they control who comes and goes on that street. So you don't need a wall around your compound, and your hostel or business can be open onto the street because you have this extra layer of security. And this was apparent in my hostel. My hostel looked like a hostel anywhere else in Europe. You could walk right in the front door. There was no gate, but there was a security guard patrolling the street. And I found that again and again. I found that also in Johannesburg. I stayed at a very nice hostel where I could park on the street, safely on the street. The hostel was right open to the street with all the doors and windows open, but there were security guards on the street itself keeping control of everything and keeping out the riffraff. And when I checked into my hostel in Johannesburg, they gave me a map showing the areas that I could go into. There was a big square, and this was the area where the business owners had hired security guards, and you could walk this little 2-block area safely. But they say, do not go out of this black line because this is uncontrolled country, and that's where you're going to get robbed. So even in South Africa is the most sophisticated of the African countries. with the exception perhaps of Morocco, the most civilized. But still, you have this huge discrepancy between rich and poor, and the poor will rob you blind if you give them the chance. They have no reason not to. And when I was in Cape Town, at the hostels I stayed in, you immediately hear of other travelers who have been robbed. I was not directly robbed myself, but there were stories. There's one woman who went hiking on one of the mountains in Cape Town. She was robbed at knife point on the hike. Another Japanese woman wandered outside of this black box they told you not to wander out of, and she got her a necklace ripped from her neck and her purse stolen. And these stories go on and on. They're just part of the background of life in Africa, that crime is there, and everyone with resources, everyone with money knows how to take countermeasures to this. You always drive with your windows shut. You don't drive into the wrong neighborhood. And people who live there know what to do and know where to go and can live semi-normal lives in spite of the crime. Your problem is you don't know all of these rules. And so you could very, very, very easily stumble into the wrong neighborhood or make mistakes that get you robbed. Now, if it's any consolation, nobody really wants to kill you. Everyone just wants your property, and if your life stands in the way of their getting your property, then your life is at risk. But you're not at risk of a random murder or random rape as much as just plain old stupid property crime, just people wanting to survive by stealing something. So I drove, I rented this car for 2 weeks, and the time I was not spending in hostels. I think I stayed in 1 or 2 guest houses, which is where, again, you have to press a buzzer, press an intercom at the front gate, and they'll let you in. And once you get into the guest's house property, it can be very, very nice. And of course, the hostels with the patrolled streets out front. And several nights I slept in the car. And this is my usual way. Whenever I have a rental car, I typically sleep in the rental car. That's what I always do in Europe or North America. I just sleep in my rental car. And in Europe, I feel completely safe doing that. And I feel completely unsafe doing that in South Africa, or of course anywhere in Africa. I don't want to lose consciousness in a remote location where someone can smash the windows and cause me physical harm. So what I did in South Africa is several nights I spent at gas stations. So as you travel the highways, these are very good highways, generally 2-lane highways, not super highways, but good 2-lane highways in South Africa. And you have roadhouses where you can buy gasoline and where they have restaurants and hotels. I don't stay in the hotel, but I do drive into their compound, because like other businesses, this is a gas station is a walled compound. It's not gated. The gates are open so people can come and go and to get gas, but there's only one way in and out, so it can be fairly well watched. And I would drive my rental car into the big this roadhouse compound and sleep in the parking lot there, and I felt very safe. And 1 or 2 times I slept in the car in prosperous looking neighborhoods where cars were parked on the street. I felt comfortable in these few neighborhoods, also sleeping in my car. So on this trip in Africa, I really was fascinated by it. I felt that I needed to see a lot more. I wanted to go to nearby countries. I learned that I could have rented a car. I could have gotten authorization to take my car to Namibia or Botswana. So after my visit to in February, I came back for a visit to Africa in June of 2017. And June it turns out to be the best time to visit Africa south of the equator is June. It's because it's winter time. You do have shorter days, but the temperature is just perfect. Was just perfect in South Africa and Namibia. So I flew in at the end of May, rented a car at the Johannesburg airport. I signed up for insurance with it allowed me to take the car to Namibia and to Botswana, and then I drove immediately to Namibia, which is maybe 8 hours or so west of Johannesburg. And as I said, Namibia is a fascinating place. It is a desert world, a desert planet with huge sand dunes that kind of drift over everything. It's like how you picture the outback of Australia, but it's much more interesting because there's much more relief in Namibia. There's more mountains and huge sand dunes and things that you don't have in Australia. Oh, by the way, if you want to see any of my photos and videos from Africa, they are all on Instagram using the hashtag GPCAfrica. GPC, Glenn Paul Campbell Africa, all one word. Look for that hashtag and you'll see all the places I visited in Africa. A couple of memorable things in Namibia was an abandoned railroad line, a narrow gauge railroad line that ran from the capital, I forget what the name of the capital is, and ran to the coast. A narrow gauge railway. It had been disused for several years, and because they weren't regularly maintaining the tracks, the sand dunes just came and crept over the railroad tracks. A lot of old, fascinating, abandoned buildings in Namibia. Ghost towns, a lot of ghost towns. Very few people in Namibia. It's just it's a ghost planet, a desert ghost planet with a lot of abandoned buildings and interesting ghost towns. I got to the coast at Swakopmund, which is the south end of what's called the Skeleton Coast, which is a very remote desert coastline where the sand dunes come right up to the ocean and spill into the coast. And if I had more time, I could have gone further north on the Skeleton Coast. I think the safety issues, I think, are relatively modest in Namibia. I don't feel as unsafe as I did in South Africa, simply because there are so few people. I would not want to travel off-road alone, and if you're going to travel off-road, you need to be renting a four-wheel drive, which they can rent you in the main city, at the main airport. I could go back and do that at some point, so I could travel into some of the really remote parts of Namibia. But it's really not something to do as a solo traveler. It's something to do in a small group. Rent a four-wheel drive with 2 to 4 people, and then you can see this really wild area. I don't think you need a lot of time there. I spent maybe 2 or 3 days in Namibia, and that was enough. I moved on to Botswana. Botswana I found to be disappointing. I didn't see much from the highway in Botswana. Supposedly there is this vast sort of swampy area I forget the name of that, where there are there's all the standard wildlife, the zebras, the hippos and stuff. But I had seen all of that stuff in my first visit, which is when I visited Kruger National Park. I mean, it's cool to see African elephants in the wild and giraffes in the wild and get really up close to these creatures, not on television, and with the only restriction being not getting out of your car, not opening the windows, not getting out of your car. But once you've done it, you don't need to do it again. So I had no real need for Botswana. I drove through Botswana. My only real memories of Botswana is that I got 2 speeding tickets in Botswana. And what they do, they have this scam running where 2 officers will sit under a tree beside the road, and they've got a fancy radar gun. They've got a fancy radar video recorder where they set up a video camcorder on a tripod, and the front of it has a radar device that tells your speed. And if you're speeding when you come around the corner, they'll flag you down and they'll give you a ticket, and you're expected to pay the ticket right there on the spot. So if the speed limit is 80 kilometers an hour and you're going 85 kilometers an hour, they're going to flag you down and give you a ticket. And the first time I did this, they took Visa and MasterCard. So they took a credit card for the ticket, and the ticket was something, I don't remember, something like $30 or $40. And that's just the tax you pay for passing through Botswana. The second time it happened, I got pulled over, and they didn't have a Visa or MasterCard machine. So they told me, what the fine was, and it was something like $40. I guess in South African currency. I handed the officer $40 cash, and he handed 20 of it, half of it, back to me. And he said, "Have a nice day." And so he kept the other half. And what I realized what was happening later is that he was taking my money but not giving me a receipt. So the money that he collected from the speeding ticket went directly into his pocket. So he was happy to give half of it back to me, because basically that's the payoff to me for not complaining about it. So that was my first introduction to corruption in Africa. It was a very benign form of corruption. I actually made my $20 on that corruption. But that was my first introduction to how things work in Africa. And how things work in Africa is that if you commit a crime, or you can be credibly accused of committing a crime, that's an excuse for the police to shake you down for a bribe. And it happened to me again later, and I'll talk about that when I get to Kenya. So I had 3 weeks with a rental car in South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. And I completed that tour, really, of those 3 countries in about 3 weeks. And I was fishing around for something else to do. I had already been to Kruger in my previous trip. And I finally cooked up the idea of visiting Victoria Falls. And I saw that I could fly into, from Johannesburg, I could fly into the Victoria side, into the Zambia side of Victoria Falls, stay at a hostel there. Then I could walk across Victoria Falls, across a bridge into Zimbabwe, and stay at another hostel there. Now, the Zambia and Zimbabwe are not countries I would normally visit, but these are very heavily touristed areas. A lot of people A lot of tourists are flying in and doing this, so I figured it was relatively safe. So I did that. I parked my car in Johannesburg at the airport, flew into the Zambia side. I guess the name of the city there is Livingstone, as in Dr. Livingstone, I presume. I remember going to a supermarket there, a normal looking supermarket. I visited the museum there, and then I took a shuttle to Victoria Falls. Victoria Falls being about 10 or 20 minutes from the town of Livingstone. And at Victoria Falls, I could see the falls, first of all, and unfortunately they were very disappointing. And the reason they were so disappointing is that this was the high season, when there's a lot of water going over those falls, and the mist is so thick that you can't actually see the falls. So if you could walk down toward the falls and you're surrounded by rain, essentially heavy rain, which is all the mist coming down, it's churned up by the falls, coming down on you in torrents. So that was a semi-memorable experience, but I can say that I've been to Victoria Falls, but I can't say that I've seen Victoria Falls because they were just so shrouded in mist. So I guess if you want to see Victoria Falls, you would go in the low season when the water flow is relatively low. But in my mind, if you've seen one waterfall, you've seen them all. I just went there because I knew it would be reasonably safe because a lot of tourists were doing it. If you see Niagara Falls, you've seen the biggest damn falls around, and you don't need to see Victoria Falls. I continued on foot with a backpack, so I left most of my luggage in my rental car in Johannesburg. Had just a small backpack with me of essential supplies. I walked across the bridge into Zimbabwe, checked in at the border there. Now the little aside for Canadian and American visitors is that whenever you cross a border in Africa, you have to both check out of the country that you're leaving and check into the one that you're visiting. So you got to get things stamped. You got to get your passport stamped, both going out of the country you came and you left, and coming into the next country. And if you don't do this, you don't get the stamp going in or out, you could be in trouble. And that actually happened to me in my previous visit to Lesotho. Lesotho is a landlocked country within South Africa. So it's completely surrounded by South Africa. And I came in my rental car and I came to the border, and there was no border gate, no border guard. And I just kept driving. I figured this is surrounded by South Africa, so maybe there are no border checks. And I spent about 6 hours in the country of Lesotho. But then when I came to leave, I had to check out. There was a gate before I could leave the country. And and they asked to see the stamp when I got stamped in, and I did not have the stamp in my passport for when I entered Lesotho. And it turns out it was not an uncontrolled border. I was supposed to have stopped at the office, and I didn't know that because there was no gate and no sign telling me to stop. So I got queried. I got interrogated by the border patrol agent. First of all, it wasn't a border agent who had initially stopped me. It just looked like a citizen employee. And they called out the border agent when they couldn't find my stamp. And the border agent reprimanded me for this and said, this is illegal. And this would have been an opportunity to hit me up for another bribe. And that's really what I expected to happen. And the border agent didn't do it, just let me drive on. I think she probably considered it, but decided not to hit me up for the bribe and just let me drive on. So from that point on, I knew that every time you cross the border, you have to check in both at the country you're leaving and at the country you're entering. And as an American, I can travel quite widely in Africa. A friend of mine who is from Israel found that she could not travel widely in Africa. She got turned away at the Namibia border because she had an Israeli passport without a visa. So you got to pay attention to the visa requirements, and if you're an American, you can look at the U.S. State Department's traveler information website. And if you're from some other country of the world, like Europe or Canada, I'm sure that your country has the same thing with all the instructions of what the visa requirements are for your passport. American passports, at least as of the pre-pandemic era, got you into most of Africa and most of the places you would want to go in Africa. So I from South Africa, I crossed into Namibia, spent a few days in Namibia, passed through Botswana, didn't spend much time there because I didn't see any real reason to. Cooked up this side trip to Victoria Falls, flew to Livingstone, Zambia, walked into I guess the name of the town would be Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. Stayed at another hostel there. I was surprised to find that the currency in use in Zimbabwe at the time was the US dollar. So you didn't have to change any money in Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe currency had collapsed, and when you went to a supermarket, you were paying in dollars. Which was quite fascinating to me. Now things have deteriorated considerably and they've made US dollars illegal, and the Zimbabwe government has issued its own currency, which of course is collapsing. So I can't say what the situation is there now. So I ended up flying out of Victoria Falls back to Johannesburg, having seen the falls, having added 2 more countries to my list, and I'm saying it's not worth it. Victoria Falls is not worth it. Zambia and Zimbabwe are not worth it. These can be risky. These are risky countries. I would not spend much time in either of them. And then I got back to South Africa. Another thing I tried to see in South Africa is the seat of government at Pretoria. So I went to the national capital in Pretoria, and I half expected there to be a tour. I expected that you could walk into the Capitol, just like you can walk into the U.S. Capitol, and sign up for a tour of their parliament. And it turns out that wasn't possible, that the parliament that represents the people in South Africa is not open to the people of South Africa. The best I could have done is hang out with the statue of Nelson Mandela outside the Parliament building. One cool thing I did while in South Africa, I stayed at this very nice hostel. I can't recall the name of it, but it was in sort of an arts district in the middle of the city, and in this arts district there were security guards on the street, so you're safe to come and go within this 2-block area. And from the safety of my hostel, I arranged a day tour to Soweto. And if you're as old as I am, you remember Soweto as a place of riots and unrest during apartheid. And so my memory of Soweto is of this intolerable slum. And the tour told me otherwise. It told me if I found Soweto to be a much more livable place. Unlike in other parts of Africa, the South African government has made great strides in reducing the extremeness of poverty. So Soweto, although it's a shanty town, it has electricity. I believe it has a sewer system. It has basic services. People are living in very rough structures, but it's not a completely uncivilized place. And now that I've been on this little tour of Soweto, I would almost go back there on my own by myself because I felt that comfortable about it. I never actually did, but I realized, I saw a different brand of poverty. So in my travels through Africa, I've seen every different kind of poverty, from extreme poverty to moderate poverty to great wealth. And this I would call moderate poverty in South Africa. There's less of this extreme, really hardship poverty that you find in other countries. And I did see this hardship poverty not really in Zambia or Zimbabwe, but in Kenya and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. In Kenya, I skirted some very rough neighborhoods. By the way, I took Uber. You want to get around in Kenya, you want to get around anywhere in Africa, just call yourself an Uber. And the prices are really low. You go anywhere in Nairobi, for $5 or less, using your Uber, the same Uber app that you use in Europe and America. It works in Africa. One little added advantage of globalization. So I completed my tour, my 3 weeks. I had 4 weeks altogether, 3 and a half weeks in with a rental car in Johannesburg. My next stop was Nairobi, Kenya, where I plan to spend two nights, and then Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, 2 nights, and then fly on to Dubai, and then back to Europe. So Kenya was my Waterloo in Africa. That's where I found out the real cost of corruption and crime, and that was in Nairobi. And in Nairobi, I checked into a hotel. I got along very well with the staff. I made friends with some of the staff members. They were very nice people. It makes me sad to make friends with people and then realize what horrible straits they were in. I remember meeting my server, my breakfast server, and chatting with her. She was from Uganda and had come to Kenya for better work opportunities, but of course they were still hard work opportunities. She was getting paid very little, so I made sure to tip her generously. So I checked into this hotel in Kenya, and then I decided to go for a walk. And I knew I was in a dangerous city. So what I did is I left my passport back in my room, in my luggage, and I took only a minimum amount of money, took the equivalent of $40 in local currency in my pocket, took a photocopy of my passport with me, and my iPhone, and that's all I had when I went out for this little journey. I didn't have my usual bigger camera because I didn't want to attract attention. I just had my cell phone, and I went out for a walk. And my aim was to walk to some museums. There was a railroad museum and a few other museums that I could walk to. So I walked across really a safer part of Nairobi. I didn't walk into the unsafe sections. This was more of the administrative and business center of Nairobi. Still, sidewalks were dirt, and a lot of evidence of poverty. I communicated non-verbally with some kids, took their pictures with my phone, and took a few more pictures at the train station. When I'm in a new city anywhere, I always go to the train station because that's kind of the hub of transport usually. And I knew that there was a train running from Nairobi to the coast, and I wanted to at least see what the train station was like. So I'm on a walkway crossing the train station. It's a really rinky-dink train station next to a big train yard. So I walked across a pedestrian bridge across the train yard, and I pulled out my iPhone and I took a picture of the train yard and the rundown trains. And a security guard came up to me and said, "That's an illegal photo. You're under arrest. You've taken an illegal photo of a sensitive installation," or words to that effect. And the communication is all in English because apparently that's the main language in Kenya. And the security guard took me to the police station, didn't handcuff me or anything, just told me to follow him. And I went to the police station, which was just a little open air office made of shipping containers off the side of the rinky-dink train station. And there I was surrounded by men in uniforms with a lot of really big guns. And the head guy started the security guard had seized my phone and had handed the phone to the head guy, and the head guy held the phone in his hand and said, "This is evidence. You've broken the law. You've taken a picture of this of the sensitive installation. You're going to jail. You're going to prison." And right away I understood what this was. I knew the ropes at this point, and what he was negotiating for was his bribe. And if I had been a less experienced traveler, I would have kind of panicked at this, but I was just cool as a cucumber. No one handcuffed me. They told me I was under arrest, but nobody handcuffed me. I just sat down on the table, and we proceeded with this negotiation. And I went through the expected little dance that you have to go through. And I said, "Well, gosh, officer, I didn't know. I had no idea this was a sensitive installation. I'm just a tourist. I just went to the museum. What do we need to do to resolve this?" And after, he issues his empty threats, and I issue my empty apologies. And if he looked at the photocopy of my passport, and I told him my passport was back in the hotel. And finally it came down to how much money did I have, and I had this $40 in my pocket, and I handed him this $40, and I shook his hand, and they let me go. The most important thing is they gave me my iPhone back. So I had, he was holding in his hand my $1,000 iPhone. So this is the only thing of value that was being negotiated. And he gave me my iPhone back, and I walked away, and I walked back to my hotel room. So later, as I'm leaving, one of the things that happened to me in Kenya is to get local currency, I usually go to an ATM. So I went to an ATM in Kenya, and I intended to take only about $50 out of my account, and I put in one too many zeros, and I got out about, I don't know, $300 or $400 came out of the machine. And I figured, well, okay, I'll just change this money back again when I leave Kenya. And when I come to leave Kenya at the airport, I found out that I've lost some money. So the money basically went into my suitcase. When I went out and did my little walkabout, the money went into my suitcase. And when I was out walking and doing my tourist thing, someone must have come into my room and opened my suitcase and gone through it and found the money and took about half of the money while not taking anything else. So that was a double whammy in Nairobi, Kenya. What I ended up losing is the $40 that I gave to the cop and maybe about $150 in currency. And what I gained from it was a powerful lesson that was worth every cent of what I lost. And the powerful lesson is, don't go to Kenya, and don't go to places like Kenya, where you have a high level of corruption and you have no reliable rule of law, where you don't know that the police are going to protect you. Now, everywhere in Europe, I know the police are there to protect me, and I know that probably nowhere in Europe are they going to try to shake me down for a bribe. And I think that's probably also true in Morocco. Probably also in South Africa. I don't think you have quite that level of street corruption in South Africa. But everywhere else in Africa, expect to be shaken down. And it happens, the way the shakedown works is you violate some little law. I've heard it happen where some tourist peed discreetly, really needed to pee, so discreetly peed in some corner, and a policeman caught him, brought him to the police station, and just fleeced him for everything he had because he had peed in a public place. And that's what they do. That's how the scam works. And this rule against photographing a sensitive installation in Nairobi is just a way for the authorities to stick it to people, to fleece them. And I've read about this happening at the Nairobi airport, where a tourist takes an innocent photo inside the Nairobi airport. And that's illegal, and that's the excuse that the authorities have, that the police have, of shaking you down for a bribe. Now, recently I've read that Kenya has passed this new law banning plastic bags, because the plastic bags end up as trash in the street. So they passed this draconian law with this huge penalty for the possession of a plastic bag, like a year in prison for possessing a plastic bag. And although I wasn't in Nairobi at the time, I knew darn well the reason for that. Because now that plastic bags were illegal, they could go through any tourist's luggage and find a plastic bag and use that as the threat to extract a tip, extract a bribe from someone. So now that I know about that plastic bag law, I'm doubly not going to Nairobi, Kenya, ever again. And I had the same feeling in Egypt, which I'll talk about later. And my next stop after Nairobi was Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which was basically at the same place, same latitude. Nairobi is just a whisker south of the equator, and Addis Ababa is just a whisker north of the equator. And it was a short little hour-long flight to get from one to the other. And I got to Addis Ababa, took a I took an Uber, pretty sure it was an Uber, from the airport to my hotel. My hotel was a nice hotel on an unpaved street, but the whole vibe in Addis Ababa was completely different. I felt at great risk in Nairobi, and I did not feel the same in Addis. It was remarkable. I had a friend in Addis, and I visited him, and that was part of what made Addis seem more friendly to me. But it also had a very modern metro system. It has a 2-line metro, elevated metro, built by the Chinese, which really opens up the city. You can, for 25 cents or so, you can get on the metro and go from one end of the city to the other. And I used the metro to get to, I had one day to tour, and I used the metro to get to the National Museum, and I did quite a bit of walking. I actually walked through one of the poor shanty towns of Addis, and did not feel at risk. Even though I'm a white person in a black world, I did not feel that threatened as I might have felt threatened in Nairobi. It's hard to say why this is. Ethiopia is a Christian country. I hate, there's churches everywhere. They aren't mosques. I don't know what the religion is in Kenya, but in Ethiopia it is Christianity. And maybe that has some little subtle effect on the population, on the morality of the population. I don't know, but I would go back to Addis again. I would want to see more of Ethiopia again, just because my experiences there were so warm. One of the warm experiences was that I went to a church, a kind of a cathedral in the center of Addis, where there were these giant tortoises, like Galapagos-sized tortoises in the churchyard, and apparently kept as pets. And a little boy was standing on the tortoises, and he would pose for me. We didn't speak the same language, but I took videos of him with my phone, standing on the tortoise, and then I showed my videos to him, and he was very amused. And his mom was with him, and his mom was very amused. She also posed for me with the tortoises. And it was just a lovely time, even though we didn't speak the language. And when we were done, I gave the boy a little tip. I think it was the equivalent of $5. And he and his mother were just so grateful. And I just felt so warm about the whole experience. And another warm experience I had was visiting the National Museum in Addis Ababa. I remember nothing of the displays. The museum was really rather small, and the displays were unimpressive. But there were school children coming to visit the National Museum. All these little school children, about 3rd or 4th grade. And they weren't interested in the museum either. They were interested in me, because I was the only white guy. I mean, maybe the only white guy they'd ever seen. And everyone wanted to get a selfie with the white guy. It was just so, you're used to there being racial discrimination as a black person in America. Well, I'm experiencing the reverse. I'm a white guy in a black world, and all the kids wanted to get their picture taken with the white guy, and it was like I was one of the museum exhibits. So I patiently posed for all these selfies, kids with their cell phones taking selfies with a white guy, and I got one of them to take a picture of me with some of the kids, which you'll find on my Instagram. And I just thought that was so lovely. And of course, we don't speak the same language, but we got along just fine. And all of my experiences in Addis were like that. I got lost for a moment and needed to call my friend, and I asked someone, and they had enough English that they loaned me their phone, because my own phone wasn't working. They loaned me my phone so I could call my friend. So Addis was a warm place. Nairobi was a scary place, and that's the difference that a culture makes, whatever the cause. Another curious thing I found in Nairobi is the time. They have a special clock not in Nairobi, but in Addis Ababa. They have Ethiopian time. So I said I wanted a shuttle back. They had a car to take me back to the airport, and I said I wanted it for I don't know 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. or something, and the guy at the counter wrote down a different time. He wrote down 4. I think what it was is that I wanted to leave at 11, and he wrote down 4 o'clock. The shuttle would come at 4 o'clock. And why is that? Why did you write down 4 o'clock? I said 11. It turns out Ethiopia has its own time, and the time begins from the time the sun comes up to the time the sun sets, because it's always the same every day. They're right very close to the equator, so the sun always rises and sets at exactly the same time every day. So that's when the clock begins. That's 0 o'clock on the Ethiopian clock, and 1 o'clock is 1 hour after sunrise, and 2 o'clock is 2 hours after sunrise. And that was totally weird and interesting. So when I was in Kenya, when I was in Addis, I met some Western tourists who told me about their visits to more remote parts of Ethiopia by bus. There was a retired couple from Germany who were traveling around, and so if I were ever to return to Africa again, I might want to go back to Ethiopia and try to get into some more of the more remote places. But as I say, don't go to Africa, and I'm not going to go back to Africa, because even in Addis, the price of life is so low, and there are so many poor people, and you stick out like a sore thumb. You're a white person in a black world, and that translates to people as being very rich and having a lot of money. And anywhere you go in Africa, you kind of make yourself a target because you're white, and you don't know who's going to come up behind you. So that was the end of my my journey in Africa. That was the last country I visited in Africa, was Ethiopia. Probably won't go back. I didn't tell you about my visit to Egypt, which is, of course, technically in Africa. I visited Egypt in 2011, June 2011, and I decided for the adventure I would travel overland from Israel. At this point I had visited Israel several times. I had visited the town of Eilat, which is the southernmost town in Israel, and came to know the border, understand where the border was, and did some research and realized that, hey, I could just walk across that border and catch a bus to Cairo. And so I kind of planned this out on one trip to Israel, and I executed it on another trip to Israel. I could fly into Tel Aviv easily because at the time I had free flight with an airline. The airline I had been laid off from gave me free flights to Tel Aviv, so I could bounce back and forth to Tel Aviv whenever I wanted. So in June of 2011, I did this. I flew into Tel Aviv. I took an Israeli bus to Eilat, the southernmost town. I took a cab to the Egyptian border, and then I walked across the Egyptian border to catch this bus that I knew was scheduled for about an hour after my arrival. And I needed to get a visa for this because you can travel into Egypt. In Egypt, Americans didn't need a visa if they flew in, but they did need a visa if they came in by land. So I had to arrange this Egyptian visa in advance. I walked across the border into the Sinai Desert, into the small town right across the border. I met a camel on the street and talked to the camel, and got to the bus station and realized that I was 3 hours early because the time had changed by 3 hours. There was a 2-hour time difference between Israel and Egypt. So I had 3 hours to kick around in this tiny town. I started walking up a hillside, and a very earnest young man tried to convince me not to walk up that hillside. He didn't speak English and I didn't speak his language, but he very earnestly warned me not to walk up that hillside. And I don't know why, but I took his advice and I walked back down the hill again and just sat at a bus station until the bus came. The bus crossed the Sinai Desert, which I do not recommend today. It's a very lawless place today. Stopped at a rest area, a restaurant with the grungiest restrooms I've ever seen in the middle of the Sinai Desert. At the Suez Canal, there's a tunnel under the Suez Canal, and at that point everyone had to get out of the bus with their luggage because they had to check the luggage to see if there was any explosives in it. So that was kind of a humiliating. You had a lineup where everyone had to line up with their luggage to be checked out by the police. Got back on the bus went under the Suez Canal. We got into Cairo. I had reserved a hostel in Cairo. Cairo is chaos, pure chaos. And the easy way to measure the chaos in Cairo is that there are about 3 million cars in Cairo, and there's not a single stoplight anywhere in Cairo. So when you get to an intersection in Cairo, the cars just sort themselves out. There might be a police officer in the middle of the intersection kind of trying to direct traffic, but he wasn't very effective. Basically, the cars just cram into the intersection and sort themselves out and come out the other side. And there's no crosswalks or walk lines. If you want to cross the street, you've just got to weave in and out of the traffic. So that's representative of what Cairo is. And I stayed pretty much close to the tourist district in Cairo, the fairly prosperous commercial center in Cairo, and everywhere I went I was constantly accosted by people trying to sell me things. Just, sir, please, where do you come from? Just almost chasing you down to try to sell you stuff. Because as long as you look like a tourist, they're going to come after you. They're really going to swarm you in Cairo. And my main purpose, of course, in Cairo was to get to the pyramids, which are right on the edge of the urban area. So basically, there's the full-blown Cairo, the high-density city, which comes up to a wall, and the wall protects this sort of national park where the pyramids are, and so what the photos of the pyramids are showing is they're looking in one direction. They're looking from the pyramids out over these endless seeming sand dunes. But if you look in the other direction from the pyramids, you see full bore Cairo, and so you pay money to get into the compound where the pyramids and the Sphinx are. And even then, there's no relief from the hawkers, no relief from the people trying to sell you stuff. And I got taken to the cleaners by someone who offered me a camel ride. And I made the mistake of, there's no fixed rate for camel rides, and I made the mistake of not negotiating the fee beforehand. And at the end of my camel ride, which was absolutely lovely, I got shaken down. Just give me more money, give me more money. Think of my children, and think of all the fees I have to pay to rent this camel. And it was just a horrible experience. So if you had been experienced in dealing with Egypt, you would know that everything has to be negotiated beforehand. You have to cut a deal beforehand before you take the camel ride. And this is probably true all over Africa, where there's no fixed prices. You've got to nail things down before you do it. So I got a lot of good selfies. I got a good picture of me on a camel in front of the pyramids, and I got selfies in front of the Sphinx, and I took a video in front of the Sphinx for some project that never panned out, and then I got out of Cairo, and I flew out of Cairo. I made my flight in the nick of time, and I realized as soon as I got out of Cairo, I just should have never gone to Cairo. It's not that anything really bad happened to me. I got fleeced at the pyramids, maybe $80, when I should have only been paying $20. I got fleeced at the pyramids, and nothing really bad happened to me, but that was just the luck of the draw. Egypt is such a chaotic place, an anarchic place, that it's just a luck of the draw whether something bad is going to happen to you. You can't rely on the police to protect you from anything. The police are just as likely to shake you down. So the lesson was, don't go to Cairo, and don't go to Nairobi, and go to Morocco, but go to Morocco only after you've seen all of Europe, because Morocco is rough. It's more of a wild west feel. There's more of the hawkers trying to sell you stuff, which you don't have in Europe. More of the sense that if you let down your guard even for a minute, somebody's going to swipe something from you. But Morocco has lots of character. It's got the very famous Kasbah, or whatever they call it in Marrakech. The classic old tiny little streets in this old market town, this old walled city in the center of Marrakech, and it is absolutely crawling with European tourists. So all sorts of services, all sorts of hostels, very nice hostels for very low prices, and very nice guest houses, because they're so used to European visitors, European tourists. And you're going to kind of get fleeced, but I don't think you have any big crime risk. Outside this walled city of Marrakech, there's a modern city which looks like any city in Spain. Again, I walked from the old walled city to the train station, and I took a photo at the train station, an innocent photo at the train station. A security guard stopped me. This was, 7 years before my incident in Nairobi, and the security guard told me that no photos were allowed of the train station, but he didn't. Quite tellingly, he did not try to shake me down for money. He just told me to delete the photo. So they have this crazy sense of security in places like this. But I do not have the sense of corruption or extreme poverty in Morocco that I have in the rest of Africa. It's really more like Europe. Morocco is halfway between Africa and Europe. So if you do want to stick your big toe into Africa, fly to Marrakech. there's also a good train system. You could take a ferry to Tangier and then take a train to Marrakech. And it's a fairly modern train system in Marrakech. Before I had my cancer in 2018, I was planning a trip to the Sahara Desert within the boundaries of Morocco. I would rent a car, fly to Casablanca, rent a car there, and drive to the Sahara Desert within Morocco. And I knew that this was well-trodden path by European tourists, so I felt relatively safe doing that. But of course, in 2018, my cancer got in the way, and I never pulled off that journey, and I probably never will. So that's the end of the that's basically the end of my superficial overview of Africa. I think I pretty well covered the safety issues. The safety issues are getting robbed, having your car broken into or your luggage broken into while it's in your hotel room, having your luggage broken into passing through the Johannesburg airport. This is a big thing. If you check your luggage into Capetown or Johannesburg, you might find that when you get to your hotel that things are missing from your luggage. That's a really common thing in South Africa, of all places, so it's got to be common in other places as well. It's just this numbing level of all sorts of low-level crime, low-level criminal crime, and the only real danger is that you, in one of these low-level incidents, you lose your passport. And if you lose your passport, you can really be screwed, especially if you're not near the U.S. Embassy. If you're near the U.S. Embassy or consulate, then you can get a new passport. I've had to do that. I've done that in Chile in 2019. So if you lose your passport, you could have great difficulties. You could have great difficulties getting on a plane just for an internal flight in a country. So you always got to be aware, anywhere in Africa, where is the U.S. Embassy or the embassy of your country? Because it could be your lifeline. It could be the people who rescue you from some dire situation. And in addition to crime, there's just the fact that the safety is a much lower priority in Africa. Things just aren't as safe. Roads aren't as safe. Roads don't have the guardrails and the line markings and all the safety features that we take for granted in North America and Europe. There could be a road with no guardrail and a steep drop-off on the side, and there are drivers driving crazy, screaming through the streets of Cairo. So you have the risk of crime, and then you have the risk of just elevated risk of all sorts of accidents, of falling into a ditch or getting run over by a truck. There's just all those safety concerns. And finally, there's the health concerns. And there are all sorts of diseases in Africa. You don't need any special vaccinations for Morocco, but you do for most of the rest of Africa. And the vaccinations you require will be found on the information page for the U.S. State Department or the equivalent for your country. What sort of vaccinations? So before I went to South Africa, I had to get vaccinated for various things, yellow fever, a couple of other things, and I got that all done in Boston before I left home. But there's all sorts of things that could happen to you. You eat the wrong stuff. I don't eat local food in Africa. I'm not going to eat any local food, any non-packaged food in Africa. I'm going to try to avoid anything that isn't cooked. No raw vegetables. It should be steaming hot when you eat it. And You got to be conscious of all these things. So these four concerns are crime, accident, corruption, and health and safety. Or that's 5 things, I guess. And those are all the things you've got to really plan in advance if you're going to go to Africa. So don't go to Africa unless you've already seen Europe. And that was true with me. When I went to south of the equator, went to South Africa, I had already seen all of Europe except for 2 countries. I had already flown around the world and seen much of Asia. Only then was I ready for Africa and its hardships. And I'm very grateful for the 7 weeks I spent in Africa. They taught me an awful lot about how poverty works, about how rich and poor get along in a country with huge inequality. This is going to be useful today. Could be useful because it gives me a vision of what America could be like as America becomes more and more unequal, with more and more with a greater discrepancy between rich and poor in America. So it was a powerful education. It was a meaningful experience to me, but I will not be going back to Africa anytime soon.